Hey everybody, today we're going to be discussing the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So starting out looking at it, the nervous system as a whole, we break down the nervous system into its structural units, the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system consisting of those peripheral nerves that extend out from the brain or the spinal cord. And of those structures in the peripheral nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system, which controls skeletal muscle, and then we have the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is going to be, as the name implies, autonomic means there's some autonomy. So this is an unconscious, no conscious control over the autonomic nervous system. This happens as a result of information feeding in, and that's processed without your conscious control. So in the autonomic nervous system, you are broken, that's functionally broken down into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. The difference between these being sympathetic is going to be fight or flight, and parasympathetic nervous system controls the rest and digest functions. So the activity of these two branches of the autonomic nervous system really depends on the circumstances that you're in at a given time. So in the case that you are in a fight, or maybe you're taking an exam, your fight or flight reflexes might start to kick in, and that includes sympathetic control. So both of these are going to help to control your heart rate, blood pressure, and the functions of the digestive and the urinary system. And it's going to optimize those based on the situation that you're currently facing. So if you're in a place where you don't need to have increased blood flow to support muscles that allow you to run or fight, you're going to be resting and digesting, and your parasympathetic nervous system will take over. So these two balance one another out in order to control these different variables whose activity really depends on what situation you find yourself in. So the somatic nervous system is going to target your skeletal muscles that you have voluntary control over. Meanwhile, the autonomic nervous system has different targets that are under subconscious control. So these are controlled involuntarily. And these include your smooth muscle. So one example of smooth muscle and its effect can be the smooth muscle that surrounds blood vessels. So you have smooth muscle surrounding blood vessels that controls their diameter. So smooth muscle contracts, that closes the diameter of a blood vessel, for example, and that can change the pace of blood flow or the blood pressure. Also, another target is cardiac muscle. So I mentioned that heart rate is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So cardiac muscle is also a target. And finally, glands. So glands that promote sweating, or certain glands that release hormones can be activated or inhibited by the autonomic nervous system. Since the autonomic nervous system operates subconsciously, we would say that the activity of the autonomic nervous system depends on visceral reflex arcs. So these reflex arcs are where a decision is being made based on incoming information for whether to activate or inhibit a certain target organ, say the heart. The heart, for example, would be a target organ that's controlled by these reflex arcs of the autonomic nervous system. So on one side, you have a sensory signal. You have some signal that's being detected in the viscera or the skin, meaning your internal organs or your skin, and they're going to send a signal to the central nervous system about a certain biological variable. And that signal is going to be sent through an afferent neuron. So the central nervous system is going to receive information and make a decision about whether or not to activate or inhibit a certain target organ. So the processing of the information occurs in the central nervous system, and a signal is sent through an efferent neuron to what are called the autonomic ganglia of the central nervous system. And what ganglia are basically collections of neurons that send their signals in a similar direction toward target organs. So the autonomic ganglia are going to collect those signals from the central nervous system and send them through another efferent neuron toward the target organ, where you get a motor response, whether that is slowing the heart rate or increasing it, or slowing the rate of motility in the digestive system, how fast food is moving through the digestive system. That depends on, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So these reflex arcs are how organs that are controlled by those fight or flight or rest and digest responses, these reflex arcs are exerting their control over those processes. So I mentioned this concept of ganglion, and to really get an idea of what a ganglion is, or ganglia is the plural for ganglion, you need to look at the structure of the neural connections of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system consists of a link between the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and the target cells that are going to be activated or inhibited. And again, those targets are going to be your cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So for the autonomic nervous system, there's a series of two neurons between the central nervous system and the target cell. And you have the pre-ganglionic neuron and the post-ganglionic neuron, 1 and 2. And each of these neurons, as is the case with other neurons, they release neurotransmitters to deliver their signal. So this pre-ganglionic neuron, the cell body is going to reside in the central nervous system. So either in the brain or in the spinal cord is where you're going to find the cell body of this neuron. Whereas the axon can travel out of the brain or the spinal cord. So the cell body of the postganglionic neuron, which is where you're actually going to find the ganglia, is going to reside within a ganglia, a peripheral nervous system ganglion. So this is now outside the central nervous system. And a ganglion, all it is a cluster of cell bodies. So we'll see what that means in just a second. So this postganglionic neuron is actually going to be delivering the signal to the target. And you might be saying, why doesn't the central nervous system send the signal directly to the target cell? Why is there a need for a postganglionic cell or neuron? And the answer for that is to save space in the central nervous system. So it's often the case that one central nervous system neuron can send a signal to many postganglionic neurons. And that wouldn't be, there would be a need for many more central nervous system neurons if you didn't have these postganglionic. So the short answer is this 2 neuron series that relays a signal to a target cell is that way because it's going to save space in the central nervous system. You only have a certain amount of space in your brain for so many neurons or within your skull. So this is a space-saving structure. But so what is a ganglia again? What is a ganglion? So if you look at a nerve, say a nerve is a bundle of neurons. Along that nerve, you're going to see little bunches. And where the nerve itself gets fatter. And the reason for that is that cell bodies take up more space than the axons. So these cell bodies, the fat part of the neuron, takes up more space. And so this ganglion is just a bunch of cell bodies for these peripheral nervous system neurons. So within a nerve, again, you have many neurons traveling in the same direction. So here would be your pre-ganglionic neurons. Here's the ganglion where you have a bunch of cell bodies together. And these are the post-ganglionic neurons that you would find in a peripheral nerve. So that's what a ganglion is, and it's this post-ganglionic neuron, the cell bodies of which that make that ganglion, that you can actually see. It's a bulge in a nerve. One other thing that I would like to mention about these pre- and post-ganglionic neurons is that it's well known what their specific neurotransmitters are. So for both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons, the pre-ganglionic neuron is going to release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So ACH. Acetylcholine is always the pre-ganglionic neurotransmitter. Now, depending on whether you're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neuron might release acetylcholine or epinephrine or norepinephrine. So we'll look at the different uses of those three neurotransmitters. But again, preganglionic neurons always acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron can release acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine. These two branches of the autonomic nervous system also differ with respect to their origin. So where do these neurons arise from? And for the sympathetic nervous system, and we're talking about where in the central nervous system they arise from. For the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight branch, it is what's called thoracolumbar origin. And that means that this is the nerves from the thoracic region of the spinal cord and the lumbar regions. So those two regions of the spinal cord are where you're going to find sympathetic neurons. Whereas parasympathetic has a craniosacral origin, which means you have cranial nerves carrying parasympathetic neurons, and you also have sacral nerves carrying parasympathetic neurons. So thoracolumbar for sympathetic, and craniosacral is the origin for the parasympathetic, or the rest and digest portion of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic or fight or flight nervous system is there to ensure your survival during a time of stress. And if you look at the structure of the neurons that make it up, again, we have the preganglionic neuron here arising from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. And it's going to be very short in comparison to a longer postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is going to have a myelin sheath, which increases the rate of conduction, the speed of conduction of that signal. And the preganglionic neuron, again, only releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, or ACH. Whereas this postganglionic neuron has no myelin sheath. It's going to be a long cell, have a long axon. And the neurotransmitters that it's going to release really depend on the receptor that the target cell has. And these are going to be acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine. Again, the purpose of the sympathetic nervous system is to promote survival in a stressful situation. So there's a lot of intuitive changes that will occur that help with this. For example, cardiac muscle is one target of the sympathetic nervous system, and once the sympathetic nervous system has been activated, that's going to increase the force of contraction. So the harder your heart is contracting, the more blood is going to be forced out. So this will increase blood flow and increase blood pressure to meet the needs of the tissues in, again, this fight or flight situation. You're also going to get dilation now, so relaxation of smooth muscle on the bronchioles. So these are the airway inside of your lungs, and when that smooth muscle surrounding those vessels is dilated, their diameter expands and you get more volume of air per breath. So that's also helpful. You get things like blood vessels dilating because of smooth muscle relaxation there. That's going to increase the amount of blood that can flow to a certain organ. You also get the urinary and digestive system kind of shutting down a bit. So resources are diverted away from digestion and urination. So these urinary and digestive sphincters are going to contract, making it harder to pass a bowel movement, for example. That's not something you want to be doing when you need to be running and fighting. And also digestive smooth muscle is going to relax, which is going to slow down the speed that food is being passed through your digestive tract. So again, resources being diverted away from where they're not needed and diverted toward where they are needed, like the tissues for such as skeletal muscle that you're going to be using a lot of in a fight or flight situation. Lastly, the parasympathetic nervous system associated with rest and digest functions is going to look a little bit different, where the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons are both pretty long. And the neurotransmitter that's released for both of these is going to be acetylcholine. And again, remember, this preganglionic neuron arises from the craniosacral region, so directly from the brain or the sacrum. So the effects of these are going to oppose those that we talked about, or just a few of them that we talked about previously with the sympathetic nervous system. So whereas cardiac muscle contractions had more force with the sympathetic nervous system, in a rest and digest state, you want to decrease heart rate. So the cardiac smooth muscle that's targeted is going to be having fewer contractions. The glands that are responsible for secreting substances that help digestion, such as the digestive and salivary glands, are going to increase their amount of secretion during the rest and digest period. And that's because you're expected to be having a meal and needing to use resources to help you digest that. So increased secretion is part of that, as well as contraction of digestive smooth muscle. So we saw that inhibited in the sympathetic nervous system, whereas in rest and digest, you want to contract that digestive smooth muscle to increase the rate of digestion. You also get relaxation of those urinary and digestive sphincters, which allow you to use the bathroom, something that is something you don't want to be doing during a fight, for sure. And instead of bronchodilation, you now have bronchoconstriction, where smooth muscle in the lungs is going to constrict or contract to lower the amount of volume per breath coming into the lungs. And that's just all about maintaining efficiency, maximum efficiency. So again, these effects of the parasympathetic nervous system really are going to oppose that you see in a fight or flight type scenario. So this was a very brief, I know, overview of the autonomic nervous system, but because we've had some of our time cut short, this is about as far in depth as I'll expect you to know for the autonomic nervous system. And tomorrow I'll be giving you your final lecture discussing the different endocrine organs and the function of hormones.